Hello everyone. We getting sound? I'm sure there'll be a delay. Any sound? Sound check. All right, cool. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining me. It's the first weekly live stream. I'm sure we will not have a whole lot of attendance, but we'll start somewhere and we'll increase it as we go. It's going to work a lot like our fireside chats, which means open questions, just ask them anytime in the chat. I'm going to mainly be going through one of our guides to try and build up some of our video documentation. The aim being that eventually we should have good written and video documentation. And then, of course, answering questions is always helpful. With that, we'll get started. I'm going to focus on starting with building the 5e SRD. Worst case scenario, this becomes just a recording session, and best case scenario, we get some live questions as we go. So with that, let's get underway. I have the 5e SRD guide pulled up here in my other window. I will not stream that. I will show you what I do. So as you can see, I'm on Hedron and I'm logged in as Invisible Polls. That's my account. And we're going to build the 5e SRD from scratch. So of course we're going to see, I'm not on the live version of it. Let's do that. There we go. Sorry, I was running on my local test environment, but now I'm on the live environment again. We're going to go to rule systems and we're going to build a 5e SRD from scratch. And I'm just going to go through it in the order we have it in the actual guides. And then that way you can follow it like one-to-one. So we'll start by creating a new rule system. And we're going to call this, just like the 5e guide, we're going to call this Livestream 5th edition SRD. So going to create, and that kind of sets up our basic SRD. It's going to be pretty empty, but we're going to go into edit here in the top right. We're going to go into more details and start working through it. Just like the guide, this is now the general tab. So the first section of the 5e guide, maybe we'll finish the guide today, we'll see. From the first tab, you'll set the rule sets description. So this is a section for you to describe to others what is in this rule system. You can kind of use this in conjunction with rule books, but you can also kind of do it yourself. So it's kind of free form how you want to approach it. For now, I'm just going to say this is the live stream SRD, and I will delete this afterwards. So the next section, cover image. I'm just going to kind of go down this in order. Some things are different from the guide, but hopefully we can update the guide. But cover image, if you ever, later on, we're going to have rule systems actually show like a cover art, especially if you have some. So this would be an area where if you click on this, you'll have this little pop-up where you can select where you get your image from. You can do the internet, your image archive, which is basically all the images you've uploaded on Hedron, or you can upload a new image, which will then get added to your image archive for you to use later. Just to quickly go through it, like you click from the internet, you'll get an area to put in a URL. If you put in a URL, this button will illuminate. It actually doesn't have to be a real URL, but you'll get an error if you don't. So that's how you upload an image from the internet. From the image archive, I don't have any uploaded images right now, but you can also upload an image like this, and then it'll pull up asking you what you want to upload. So moving on. In the enabled functionalities, you have basically what functionalities will your rule system need. So for the SRD guide, this is a section that was there in one screenshot but not in the other. The long story short is abilities kind of act as like all the different containers for things your characters can do. Classes are basically a means of structuring the leveling system of your rule system. Items are a way to, have items that characters gain, lose, use, activate, equip, so on. Item properties are sort of like reusable modifications to items, and I'll have a more detailed guide on this later. For 5e, we don't actually need this, so I'm going to turn this off. feats are basically progression. Like as you progress, you might get certain abilities that you can kind of freeform choose from anywhere in the rule system. That's what feats are for. If you've played Pathfinder, or if you've played 3.5, you'll know the term feats, and that's kind of where it comes from. And then spells and shared abilities, I kind of rename it to not just spells, because this is sort of like a broad usage. Like if you have abilities that share a sort of pool of reusable resources, like mana or power source or things like that, like you would use spells to contain it. Casting modifications are ways to modify how spells work on the fly. For 5e, we're not going to need it. Heritages are basically abilities and groups of abilities you'll get at the start of your character building. So we're going to leave that one in charge. And so some of these things, you're going to notice they're going to have different names in different systems, and that's okay. We're just going to leave it as is for now, and we're going to rename it later. Moving on, we've got the default dice configuration. And so, as you can see, it's used to specify the initial dice configuration when a new check is created. These can be overridden and are purely for convenience. So this is the important part. This is purely for convenience. You don't have to set this in great detail. Some systems might not even have a good dice to use for this. We do. So 5e almost exclusively will use a d20 for almost all of your checks. So we're going to set it as d20. And then you basically have two options. You have standard and dice pool for how this dice is applied. So if you set it to standard like this, when you create a new check, it will initialize the check as the name of the calculation plus the 1d20. If I had done dice pool and I was setting up a strength check, the default for the strength check would actually be a number of d20s equal to your strength. Whereas if I set it to additive, it would be strength plus a 1d20. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. Moving on, we then have the bonus options and identical bonus type stacking. So what that's for is basically determines how are different like bonuses of different kinds combined together to create your final output for your system's calculations. So in 5e, bonuses are kind of simple. They just kind of always add together. So we can just leave this unchecked because in this case, if the bonus is the same type, then we don't want it to stack. But if it isn't the same type, and as long as there's no type defined, then it would also stack. So this is only really relevant if you're playing like Pathfinder, where you have, different types of bonuses that you want them to stack or don't want them to stack. In Pathfinder, you actually also leave this off, but there might be systems where you have types that don't actually influence whether or not they stack. And then rounding strategy, you've got a lot of different rounding strategies. This is basically how are numbers and fractions handled. So you'll get things like down strict, round up, and then you'll see towards 0. Oh, there's a typo here. Good. Found a live bug. One of these should be away from 0. And actually, I think if you hover over it, yeah, it does clarify. One of these is towards 0. So these two are towards 0. These second two are actually away from 0 and away from 0 strict. If you hover over them, you'll actually see it. And I'll actually fix this in a bug patch tonight. So by the time anyone looks at this, you'll already see it's changed. But to quickly explain it, the guide actually has a nice visual that you can see, which is a little bit more helpful, I would say. But let's see if I can open this. Yeah, I can do this. We'll just zoom this in. So this is a image from the guide that explains how the difference between strict and normal rounding. So for example, in this case, we're looking at rounding as a strategy. So the normal rounding. So like 0.5 and above goes up, and then less than 0.5 goes down. So like 14.1 becomes 14, 14.7 becomes 15, so on and so forth. There's a difference between strict and regular rounding. So when you're playing your system, you might have lots of different bonuses that sort of progressively add individually. And so what you want to do when you're setting this up is you want to configure, do you want it to round every time a bonus is applied, or do you want to only round at the very end? So for example, on the left side, let's say we start with your base strength is 10 and your level is 3, and you have 2 bonuses. Each of them adds half your level to your strength. So if your base strength is 10 and you have non-strict rounding, you add half your level, that's 3 over 2, you get 11.5. And because it's not strict, we're not going to round. So you now have 11.5 plus another 3 over 2, which is half your level. So you get 13. 13 doesn't need to be rounded, so your final strength is 13. However, if you do strict rounding, you'll see a slightly different result. You get 10 plus 3 over 2. That equals 11.5. But because it's strict rounding, we're going to round immediately. So that 11.5 becomes 12. And then the next time we have 12 plus 3.5, which gets rounded up to 14. So your final strength is 14. That's a sort of like high-level explanation of like what this means. And we're going to keep going as we go through this. You're going to see that there's different kinds. So there's down, there's round, there's up, there's towards 0, and away from 0. So down is that all numbers will always round downwards. And the strict versus not strict just determines how often they are rounded down. So like 11.7 would become 11, even though it's above 0.5 views down. Round is what we just talked about, where it's the halfway point determines if it goes up or down. Up is always round up. And then towards 0 and away from 0 are some of our newer features. I really wish this was correctly named, but we'll get through it. Towards 0 means that positive numbers will get rounded down and negative numbers will get rounded up. So basically, the no matter which side of 0 you're on, you'll get closer to 0 whenever you have to round. Away from 0 is the opposite. Away from 0 will move you away from 0. So positive numbers move upwards, like they round upwards, and the negative numbers round downwards. And then, of course, you have the none option, which just means never round. You'll use decimals wherever it's relevant. And then rulebooks is probably the most simple thing to explain here. It's basically when you look at the various tabs, and we'll go through them in sequence, the various tabs are not really good for human reading. They're good for computer reading. So they're really helpful for like Hedron to understand how your system works. But you're probably going to also want a place for your rules to actually be written down in a way that isn't going to be hard to understand. So let me just show a quick example. If I was to open up in my other window, like for example, my rule system, call to power. Here we go. You add this. So if you look over here, call to power, this is the rule system this is the book for the rule system. So like if I go into like, let's say alchemy, it's the written explanation of what alchemy is. Whereas in my system, I just define the math that controls how to calculate an alchemy bonus. So with that, for now, we're just going to leave this blank. This is purely optional. It's good for your future users of your rule system, but right now you don't really need to have it. Okay, moving on to something more interesting and more complex, and I think something that people have a harder time with. And we're just going down the guide. This is now the timekeeping section. An important note that the guide makes and that I will also make, this is not the same as a calendar page. So calendar pages in Hedron are used for like lore. So if you have like fictional fantasy calendars, you'd use a calendar page. This is more to represent your rule system's like actual time units. So like, how long does a spell last? How long does an ability last? How long does it take to rest? How long does it like take to do whatever? So in 5e, we're going to basically be setting up a pretty standard approach for this. So I'm just going to create a bunch of empty ones, and we're going to set seconds. We're going to set minutes. We're going to set hours, days, weeks, and we'll actually also add a forever unit. So what are these different columns? So now that we've named them, this is just naming it. We have an abbreviation section. I'm not going to make any abbreviations just to be a little bit more succinct, but you could name it whatever. Like you might name S for seconds, M for minutes, H for hours, so on and so forth. And then you have this number. So if you delete this number, it says absolute time, basically. It's how long, it's basically used to represent how long are units relative to each other. So we're going to have our seconds be 1, which basically means the absolute time here represents how long something is in seconds. So we're going to say seconds are 1, which makes minutes 60, because there's 60 seconds in a minute. It's going to make hours 3,600, and then it's going to make days 86,400. Yes, I had that number pre-prepared. And then it'll make weeks 604,800. But then you have this weird situation of like, what about forever? So forever is sort of a tougher spot because it's like, well, what does forever mean? Like, what does it represent? And to set that up, we're just actually going to click this little icon, which says mark as infinite. And then it gets marked as infinite. If you edit it, you'll just see that there is a mark as finite button, but otherwise it stays the same. So with that, we kind of set up a bunch of different units. They will get sorted according to their time units. Infinite gets placed right after seconds. And we're going to actually create one more. Because, so this is all the numerical times, right? This is how long spells will be measured in and those kind of things. But there's one more unit we have to create because a lot of 5e, at least, relies on the concept of a round, which is like how long an initiative passes whenever there's conflict of some kind. So let's say we're going to create a round, and rounds last 6 seconds, so it's a 6 here. And then we're going to save that. Let's talk a little bit more about initiative. So time units here are all about defining time and the passage of time, but they don't really talk about how does someone take a turn, for example. Like in 5e, you roll initiative and then you take turns. Every turn you have a certain number of actions and then you have some reactions and so forth. This doesn't really cover that. And especially it's a little bit more complicated because if you think about like in 5e, you have an action, a bonus action, and a reaction. How much time does each of those represent? It's not exactly clear because the order of them also doesn't matter. You can take your action first. You can sometimes you take reactions on other people's turns. It's all sorts of things where it's like it doesn't make sense like from a time temporal perspective. That's what action economy systems are for. So they're kind of related to time units, but they're not exactly the same. So for the system label, this is just basically like when you're in your action economy resolution system, like what is it called? For 5e, that's going to be initiative. For the cycle label, it's going to represent what does it mean when a full cycle of everyone's turns has passed. And in 5e, it's going to be turn. So like if everyone takes like, a turn and then maybe you call it something different, what is that cycle of everyone having done whatever they need to do called? And then this is cycle true duration is the duration of each cycle in true time units. So as I mentioned, bonuses and reactions and bonus actions, they don't really, I meant to say actions, bonus actions, and reactions don't really have a real time conversion, but a whole round does. So we can actually say the cycle's true duration is 1, and then we can say round. These are all units that we defined up here. So this basically says every turn in our initiative system takes 1 round of real time, which means that if you had something like a spell that lasted 1 minute, we know that it's 60 units, whereas a round is 6 units. So the end result is it lasts 10 rounds. This is how the system kind of understands when things should stop and when things should start and those kind of things. In terms of actions per cycle, let's take a look at this. Let's create actions for all of the different kinds of things. So we have action, and then we have bonus action, and then we have reaction. And I should turn off my dash line. Okay. Refresh this. Okay. Yeah, we're gonna have to reset this because I just refreshed because I wanted to turn off my dash line. So let's do 1. I'm just gonna go quickly through this round, and then we create our 3. We're gonna have actions. We're gonna have bonus action, and then we're gonna have reaction. So now we have the actual fields of like how to define this. So we have a quantity per cycle. This is basically when someone's turn is up, how many of these do they get? For actions, it's 1. For refresh rates, refresh rates are basically how many of this quantity are refreshed every turn. So for example, in Divinity Original Sin 2, you get 4 action points every turn, but you can have a maximum of 6. So your quantity per cycle is 6 as like a maximum, but your refresh rate is only 4. So it kind of lets you save up in that sort of way. So in 5e though, you get 1 action and it always refreshes. And you can kind of think of quantity per cycle as your maximum number of units that you can have. So we're going to set 1 for all of these, because that basically means that you get 1 action and it refreshes every round. You have 1 bonus action and it refreshes every round. You get 1 reaction and it refreshes every round. And then we could define conversions here, which is basically a way to convert actions between each other. So like, for example, maybe you want to say 1 reaction can be converted into 1 regular action. For example, if you're in Pathfinder, the equivalent of reaction is immediate actions. Immediate actions convert into swift actions if you don't use them. So this is a way to set that up, basically. In 5e, though, we don't need that, so we're just going to leave it. And so that basically explains how we're going to set up all of our time. Make sure you save real quick so you don't lose any progress, and then you can see that it's still here. That's first just the timekeeping aspect of things. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to see if there's any questions or comments about how we've set up time so far. Of course, this will all be published as a video, so there's always going to be a resource for times. Take a quick minute, so if anyone has any questions about how we set up times or the general tab, before we go into the big meaty one, the character derivations tab, let me know. So far, so good. Waiting a little bit just to see if anyone has any questions. Okay, let's keep going. Character derivations. This is probably the most difficult tab to set up in your entire rule system. But bear with me, once you set it up, you never have to look at it again, and it works, and it's just nice, and it's fine. It also, once you, I think, get a handle on how it works, it becomes a little easier to understand. So let's start by talking what is a character derivation. And actually, I want to rename this functionality to character calculation instead, because what a character derivation is it is a single calculation that is made as a part of characters. So strength is a calculation. Strength modifier is a calculation. Hit points is technically a calculation, but we have a separate tab for hit points, so we can leave it out for now. And then, constitution modifier, acrobatics, athletics, like whatever, anything that is calculated in your system has to be put somewhere, and the character derivation tab is a great place for it. The only other place that would be really viable for a lot of these calculations is the character fields tab, which I will go into detail later. But furthermore, character derivations, aka character calculations, by the time you probably watch this, are basically calculations that are also grouped. So the reason you group them is because this allows you to set up functionality for point investment. So like, for example, a lot of RPGs have this concept of skill points, where every level you get some number of skill points and you can invest them in wherever you want. So like, to give some examples, in 5e, you get skill point. You don't actually get 5e skill points. So in 5e, you do get attribute points every 4th level. So every 4th level, you get to increase one of your attributes. You also, in Pathfinder, you get skill points that you invest into different skills. In Skyrim, the Bethesda Studios Skyrim, it's an RPG, not the kind that Hedron supports, but it also gives you various kinds of points that you can invest into things, and specifically it gives you perks that then give you other things. You could set it up theoretically. Anytime there is some sort of like investable resource that is shared across several calculations, that is a good category for a derivation group. In 5e, I've already identified the groups. For 5e, we're going to have a group for ability scores. And you'll notice as soon as I clicked new derivation group, it added a section for this unnamed derivation group right below. So don't get worried about it. We'll get down to it when we get down to it. For right now, we're just going to name all of our character derivation groups. This is actually how I recommend people generally should approach it, is start by defining all of your character derivation groups, and then you go into the details of how they calculate and all those things. So let's start with ability scores. And then we're going to have another one called ability score modifiers. Why are they separate? Well, because ability scores you invest points into. However, you do not invest points into your ability score modifiers. They're just a direct calculation as a result of ability scores, so they should be separate because they share a separate pool of investable resources, aka ASI. So, continuing on, we're going to keep going. Saving throws. You have your skills, and then we're going to create an other category, and this will sort of be the category for all of the other kinds of calculations that will happen. Something the guide says, which I think is a good tip, is if you're ever not sure if something should be 2 derivation groups or 1, it most likely should be 2. There are some cases where it might be 1, but if you're ever not sure, it's most likely going to be 2. So, having all this, we can save all of these, and we're going to move on to actually setting up their calculations. We're going to start with the ability scores. Oh, good, it's already selected. So, just like the guide, we are going to set these up first. We're going to set up a point-buy system, but you could also set up a dice-based system. So you could make it so every calculation is just based on, like the initial calculation is just based on some like 3d6, for example. That's a common way to roll for stats. So you could do that. We're not going to do that. We're just going to set up point buy because it kind of shows some of the other mechanical ways to set up things. So for the ability scores, there is a chart, and I'm not going to, I guess I could really quickly show the chart too. Why not? Might as well get good explanations. This is how point buy works in 5e. So if your attribute score is 8, then you're, or if it's 8, then you have not increased your score at all, and it costs 0 points. If it's 9, you've increased your score by 1, and it costs 1. Similarly, 10 is an increase of 2. It is a cost of 2. You'll notice that it's 2 for 2, 3 for 3, 4 for 4, 5 for 5. But then here, when you've raised your score to 14, it's a 6-point increase, or a 7-point investment. So you have to invest 7 points to increase your score by 6. Likewise, you have to invest 9 points to increase your score by 7 to a total of 15. So there's also the concept of ability score increases, or ASI, which we'll get to. So let's go back to what we were doing. First, we have points. So let's set up the every 4th level, you get 1 point to invest into any ability score. The way you do that is your initial point stays at 0. For now, we're going to come back to that. And we're going to set up the points. And points are basically like every level, how many points do you have to invest? We're going to set this into scaling, add component. We're going to say character level divided by 4. Notice these parentheses. We are using strict rounding. So the contents of these parentheses will be rounded immediately. In other words, it's going to do character level over 4, and then it's going to immediately round the result. So that means, because we're using strict down rounding, and maybe I should double check I actually set that correctly, but we're going to use strict down, so character level over 4. So if you have character levels 1, 1 over 4 is going to be rounded down to 0. 2 over 4 gets rounded down to 0. 3 over 4 gets rounded down to 0. 4 over 4 is now 1. That doesn't get rounded. So at level 4, you have 1 point to invest. And then level 5, you still have 1 point to invest. Level 6, you still have so on and so forth. So we're going to set that as character level 4. Then we're also going to invest, or set up the initial point buy calculation. So when you initially are setting your character, you get 27 points to invest. And that's just sort of based on the rules. If you just look into the calculation for point buy, it's just you start with 27. And then there's no concept of a minimum points per derivation. There's no concept of a maximum points per derivation. In other words, you can invest as many points as you want into anything. However, there's an important distinction here. Where at character level of 4, you get 1 increase. And that increase is just always 1 increase. So it'll increase your strength from like 14 to 15 or 15 to 16. It'll increase a 9 to a 10. But if you remember from our point buy explanation, point buy is not always 1-to-1. So this is an exception to the rule. So we're going to actually have to set that up. We're going to skip the check section for now. We're going to go to point mapping, because that's how you set up that sort of non-1-to-1 mapping. Let's create a bunch, because we're going to need a bunch. Specifically, we're going to need 1 for every possible mapping. So how do you look at this and read this? Input 1 becomes 1. That kind of sounds correct. So for us, we're going to say input 0 becomes 0. Input 1 becomes 1. Input 2 becomes 2. Input 3 becomes 3. Input 4 becomes 4. Input 5 becomes 5. And now remember that increasing your score by 6 actually costs 7. So we're going to say input 7 becomes 6. In other words, increasing your score by 6 costs 7 input. Similarly, for this last one, input 9 becomes 7. and you're not actually allowed to invest more than that at the start. So this is what that sets up. Because these are all currently unchecked on all of these, right now, this would apply all the time. As in, no one, no matter what level they are allowed to invest more than 9 points in any particular attribute, and that would raise it from 8 to 15. And it won't let you raise higher than that. But that's not how 5e works. In 5e, every 4th level, you get that 1 point that will always increase it, and it will increase it to up to, I think, a maximum of 18, if I remember correctly. So we're actually going to say point mapping at start for all of these, which basically means that these calculations, these point mappings, will only apply at the start, at character creation. They will never apply after that. So that 27 points you get at the beginning have to follow this like non-linear scale. But then after that, at all the level ups, they're just going to use a 1-to-1 mapping because there are no point mappings at level ups. So like none of these are checked, so it's just going to use a 1-to-1. If I wanted to, I could actually also set up input 0 becomes 0, input 1 becomes 1, 2 equals 2, and then I could set it up all the way to whatever number I want, and then have those all apply at level ups, or I could do some combination of the two where I have some of these apply at level ups and some of these not apply at level ups, which would basically put limitations on what kind of point investment people can do, and then the system would make sure that anyone's point investments are actually legal. So, moving on. Let's actually save all of this. I always say you should save regularly when you're editing your rule system, just because, you never know when a bug or some issue might come up. So you want to make sure that everything is saved frequently just to keep you from losing any stuff. Okay. There's a section for properties. Properties, I'll actually just read it from the guide. Properties are basically some sort of field or value that are derivation specific and might be affected by class choices, feats, etc. Ability scores in 5e do not have any sort of special properties. We do have properties for skills, so we'll get back to that. So don't worry, but for now, we're just going to skip the properties section. Now let's create derivations. So let's remember what we're doing here. We're creating derivation groups that then contain derivations, and each derivation represents a single calculation. So right now we've created most of the setup for our ability scores, but we haven't actually created any ability scores. So now we have to actually create all of the ability scores. So let's start with strength. If we set up strength, it's going to start like this. So there's a lot of different calculations here, and actually a lot of these fields work similarly to entity fields, which we'll touch on later. But for now, we'll go through each of these fields individually. First of all, character input. If you hover over it, it says, this determines if characters can put points that contribute to this value. In other words, are characters allowed to invest in this? In other words, you could have points that are shared across skills, but you could have some skills not be eligible for point investment, but other skills are. This kind of makes it so you can have a little bit less cluttered of a derivation group setup. So we're just going to say character input is allowed, and the input point scalar is 1, and the base value is 0. What do these things do? Base value basically says that the actual investment that people start with is 0. So like they don't start with any points invested in it. They don't start with any sort of initial input. They can obviously reduce it. So like if you wanted the ability scores to start at 10, you could say the base value is 2. And that would mean that everyone starts with 2 points invested in strength, which means their strength would actually, instead of being 8, it would be 10. And then they could always reduce it down if they wanted to. But for now, we're just going to leave it at 8 because that's how the typical point buy, at least according to my resource, worked. So point buy, and then input scalar is basically if I invest 1 point in this, how many increase will I get? So how much increase will I get? So right now it's 1, which means 1 point invested increases your strength by 1. Makes sense. If I wanted 1 point to increase my strength by 2, I would set this to 2. If I wanted 1 point to actually be an increase of 0.5, that also works. I could do 0.5. You could even, if you wanted to, set a negative number. You could make it so input investments actually reduce a number. This is particularly helpful for roll under systems, but for 5e, it's just 1-to-1, and so we're going to leave it as 1. Here's the catch. We have point mapping set up. So whenever the point mappings are in effect, they take precedence over the input scalar. excuse me, dust, that part of the year. So let's set this back to 1. Point mappings will take precedence over the input point scalar. So if you have any point mappings that are applicable, the input scalar doesn't matter. Then there's additional bonus calculation. So what does initial bonus calculation do? This basically says, what is the score, like, assuming investment doesn't matter. Sorry, it's that time of the year, all the dust and pollen. So when we're setting up additional bonus calculations, you'll notice we set up point mappings for 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on all the way up to 7. Where's the 8 coming from? We basically have, as it currently stands, if a character was created in our system, their strength would be 0, and they could add points to increase it to a maximum of 7. We need to change that because we want them to start at 8 and increase to a maximum of 15. So all we have to do is just add 8 here. Simple. This basically means that when a point calculation is being done for what is your final strength score, it will do 8 plus your character input, which is going to be a 1-to-1, except for the point mapping at the beginning. And then that's your final result. Simple enough. A field that is new since we wrote the guide and we have to update the screenshot is subgrouping. This is purely for organizing your derivations. So if you have a derivation group, but then you want to group certain things under the derivation group together, subgrouping is the way you do that. It's purely for cosmetic, doesn't do anything functionally. And then rounding override is if you wanted your derivation to use a different rounding mechanism than the rest of your rule system, you can set that up. So a good example, well, not the greatest example, but maybe eventually a good example. My system, call to power, when we round, we generally round down in almost every case. But there is one exception. When you're computing your AC does not round until the very end. So we use a round down, except for at the end where we use we use strict round down, except for at AC, which we use regular round down. So that's the kind of use for rounding overrides, is that you can create certain derivations that use different rounding schemes than others. Okay, moving on. Conditionals. This basically says, is this derivation conditional? As in, is this derivation there for every character, or is it hidden by default for certain characters? In 5e, everything is non-conditional, so you can basically ignore this almost entirely. And then lastly, the minimum and maximum values. This is basically a calculation that you can use to say, never let this final number be higher than something or lower than something. In this case, for 5e, we want to enable both of these, and we want to set the minimum as 8, as in no character can have a minimum, it can have a derivation of strength lower than 8, and then we want a maximum of 20. These are both just kind of sort of things from the rules that kind of say that you should never have a score below 8 or above 20. There is something else to note, especially if you're a veteran. You might notice that when you edit a bonus calculation, especially on the advanced tab, there is a minimum and maximum value here as well. What is the difference? When you set a minimum and maximum value for this specific bonus, it means that this calculation at the bottom, this 8, can never be below 8 or above 20. So if I did this, I could never have this 8 be less than 8 or above 20. Right now it's not a complex thing, but if this was a actual character calculation, like character level +2 or something, then character level +2 at level 1 would be 3, but because our minimum value is 8, it would get pulled up to 8. However, this 8 and this 2 does not affect other bonuses. So you could have bonuses that increase your strength. And if we don't set a derivation minimum and maximum value, and we only relied on this minimum and maximum in this calculation, then you could have start in 8, and then the characters invest up to 15, and then you could have a bunch of different bonuses that increase your strength even further, and it could go past 20. That's why you set up a maximum value. A maximum value basically says, no matter what, never, no matter what, let this derivation exceed this value. Similarly, the minimum says, no matter what, never let the derivation be below this value. For the maximum, it's worth noting that the maximum and minimums actually, if they're set to 0, they'll be ignored. They'll only matter outside of that. But you also have to enable them. So if you wanted 0 to be applicable, then you have to enable it and set this number explicitly to 0. If you leave it as 0, like when you create a new derivation, it starts at 0. This doesn't do anything until I enable it and then I set it to 0 here. I think now the default is that it starts by settings to 0, but just so you know, if you ever see a bug, that's probably something related to that. And then checks. Notice this important disclaimer. You must save this rule set with this derivation before it can be used in other calculations or given a related check. It basically means until you save this rule system, it won't actually let you reference strength in other calculations. This is an important tidbit. We're working on making this not a requirement anymore, but for now it is. So if you click save, it'll save automatically if you had autosave, but I can also manually save it at the top. So going back to our ability scores, we now have our strength available to us. And you'll actually notice when it's collapsed, it says player input +1 bonus term. That bonus term is the 8 that we set up here. So now this is how you set up strength. And now we can also add a related check. So if we wanted strength checks to be a thing, which they are, then you just click this. And then because of our default dice configuration, it actually set it up perfectly. It's called a strength check, strength +1 d20. What is the point of checks? Checks are basically a way to set up a calculation that happens when you roll a die. So if we had set up this additional bonus calculation to have a 1d20, then when characters are created, or specifically when a character enters a campaign, they would have to roll that 1d20 and then that number gets locked in. So they can never change it. So that becomes a part of their calculation. That's actually how you would set up like roll for stats. You could set up roll for stats to be like, oh, instead of point investment, instead of messing with all this stuff, you just have additional bonus calculation include a 3d6, for example. Actually, I'll just show you what that looks like. So if we wanted to set that up, we do add component. You have at the end here, you put a 1, and then you say this is 3d6, like that. And then you'll notice the calculation just says 3d6. This means if a character had this calculation and they entered a campaign, they would be asked to roll 3d6, and then they would have to set that. Hypothetically, let's say you wanted to be like, oh, roll like, you know, several 3d6 sets and then find the, and then like distribute it however you want. The way you would set that up is you make them all 3d6 calculations, and then when you actually are asked to roll it, Hedron will ask you, do you want to roll for you? Like, do you want Hedron to roll for you, or do you want to put in a number yourself? So you'd basically have everyone do their 3d6 rolling themselves, and then they would assign it to each appropriate attribute. We want to make that smoother, but like that's kind of where we are right now. But anyway, let's go back to the guide. For the guide, we just want a simple +8 calculation, nothing fancy. That's it. Now, to set up the other ones, we could do all this all over again. We could set up each individually, but I recommend you use the full copy button that we have here. So I would just create a full copy of all of these. You'll notice it just adds a bunch of 2s just to give you unique names. And then we just have to go in here and rename all of this. You'll notice it copied the checks themselves, and it actually copied the calculations. And you'll notice I can't set dexterity here because I haven't saved dexterity yet. So an easier way to do this is you just remove the check from all of them, because then when you come back and you save things, you can just add the related checks and then it'll be applicable. Let's do Constitution and then remove this check. We'll add Intelligence. Also remove the abbreviations. Charisma. Remove the check, remove the check. One more copy, and then just remove that, delete, and that's it. Now we save all of these. You actually don't have to click these saves. These are just to collapse the screen. And then you do this, character derivations, you back to ability scores. And now all we have to do is just open these up again and add related check, add related check, add related check, add related check, add related check. And now just to verify, we have wisdom, starts at 8. We have 1 investment. Wisdom check is a wisdom +1 d20. Charisma, likewise, charisma check, charisma +1 d20. Additional bonus is 8. Looks good. Intelligence, 8. Intelligence check. Yep, looks good. Constitution check, constitution +1 d20. This all looks good. And dexterity, this all looks good. And let's just double check. Yeah, strength also still looks good. So this basically covers how you would set up all of your attributes. While we're here, let's cover the very related topic of setting up your modifiers. In 5e, the modifiers follow a very standard formula. In short, the formula is ability score minus 10 over 2. And there's no investment. So points, there is no investment, so we can leave this entire section completely blank and skip it entirely. And then we're going to go down to derivations. We're just going to simply add your strength modifier. And we're going to set the calculation to something a little bit more interesting. We're going to go scaling. We're going to add a component. We're going to say strength. We're going to say minus 10 because it's adding a minus 10. That's subtracting 10. And then we divide the whole thing by 2. So strength minus 10 over 2. That's the calculation for modifiers. That's just how 5e works. We're going to create a copy of this for all of our attributes. And this is actually still easier because what you can do is, even though the calculation is now incorrect, what we can do is we can just change strength to dexterity like that. And then we go and do the same thing for all of them. A little bit of tediousness, but as of right now, that's the only option. Constitution, I can spell, yes. Okay, keep going. Just some manual entry here. Charisma minus 10 over 2, all good. And wisdom. Remember, if you have any questions as we're going, just feel free to throw them in chat. I am keeping an eye on it. And then you'll notice I created an extra one by accident, so I'm just going to delete this. And I think that's all of them. So we can just go ahead and save directly from the top. And then we have all these ability score modifiers. Now, you'll notice I made a mistake, actually. You'll notice that I made strength checks actually add your full strength. That's not actually how 5e works. You actually add your strength modifier. So that's my mistake. That's okay, though. Hedron makes it pretty easy to make these adjustments. I swear this wasn't scripted. This is actually just a genuine mistake that I realized is actually a good opportunity to show something. So let's just remove all these checks really quickly. This is probably the most tedious part. Maybe we should add a button to just do all of them at once. So we've removed all of the checks from our ability scores. There's no checks on any of these anymore. And we don't have to save them, but, we'll save them. And we'll actually save the whole system. You don't have to, but we want to move all those checks here. So you might be like, oh, I have to go click all these add related checks one at a time. What if I had like 50 skills? Well, there's actually a button to make it easier. You'll notice a little plus sign next to checks that says derivations with checks, 0 of them out of 6. If you click this, it'll ask you, would you like to apply default checks to all 6 derivations in this group? Derivations will be given a check equal to their value plus 1d20. This does not affect derivations with checks already. In other words, if I say yes here, and I'm going to say yes, it will add a check to all of the derivations in this group. It's just sort of like a little convenience, saves you some time. If you customized any of the checks already, it won't affect them. So it only affects ones that don't have any checks. So if I click this, it says 6 out of 6 now have checks. And if I look, strength modifier check, dexterity modifier check, wisdom modifier check, they're all set. All I have to do, just for convenience and to be system consistent, we just remove the word modifier, and then everything else stays the same. And done. We've already moved all of our checks from ability scores to ability score modifiers. Okay, so we're running a little bit out of we're running out of time just about now, so this is probably a good place to stop. We'll go into skills and other things next time. We're just about covered up through the ability score modifiers in the rule systems. And I think the guide has a little bit more detail about how it looks when you're actually in a session and all those things. Next would be saving throws, and then we'll move on from there. But yeah, that sort of covers derivations. Let's talk a little bit about some of the other things worth talking about, some of the questions I often get about derivations. What if you're building a system and you decide to change how a derivation is calculated? Does that mean you have to delete it and actually recreate it, and then everyone has to update everything? No. Actually, I recommend specifically don't delete derivations if you're just updating the calculation, because Hedron is smart enough to basically detect when you're just changing a calculation of some kind. And so if you, for example, went into your ability scores and then you went to like your strength or something and you changed this bonus calculation, or maybe you changed the rounding override, or you changed the point mapping or anything like that, as long as you didn't delete and recreate it, it'll actually propagate the update to all of your characters automatically. So like if I made so strength starts at 80 instead of 8, and you change that number, then all characters will suddenly notice their strength starts at 80 instead of 8. They don't have to do anything. They don't have to update anything. They just have their stats updated automatically. So this is a sort of way that you can, if you're an indie developer trying to create a new system, it's a really good way to playtest in the sense that things will automatically just update everywhere. And generally speaking, it shouldn't cause any issues when you add new checks. The main thing that we notice that causes issues right now, and we're trying to fix this, is if you delete an entire thing that is being referenced. So if you delete a derivation, that should be okay, but sometimes it causes a bug. And we're eliminating those bugs one at a time, but that's sort of where we are. But yeah, in short, don't be afraid of changing things in your rule system. Don't be afraid of saving things constantly. Actually, whenever you save, it actually propagates the update of your rule system to any one that like has a character and has like entities on the site. However, another thing to worth note, if you have 2 tabs of Hedron open and you update the rule system in one, the other one will not get an updated copy of the rule system until it refreshes. It just has to be refreshed once, but it has to be refreshed because it has to reload the rule system. Otherwise, it'll use an old version of the rule system, which isn't necessarily bad. It just means that like you'll see things are not in sync a lot, which can just be fixed by refreshing. If you click the sync button, it'll basically undo the updating of entities across the site. And maybe I'll make a more practical example / guide of what that looks like. But anyway, we're wrapping up here in a second. I just want to ask if anyone has any questions. I'll stick around for a few minutes, just ramble, I guess, as I wait for any questions. Hopefully this guide was a good start. We're probably going to take this live stream video, break it up, and then turn it into like a continuous like video series you can watch for different topics. And then hopefully over time, we'll build up like a nice repertoire of all sorts of video guides about building 5e, building the Year Zero engine, so on and so forth. There will be a way to also, if you ever have ideas for topics, just feel free to throw them in chat. Eventually, I'll try to make a more organized way of proposing new topics. But we'll sort of go from there. Yeah, any other questions? We're just going to wait, see if there's anyone else who has a question related to anything. Oh, backer kit surveys. While I'm here, I'll give some updates. Backer kit surveys are being pending approval from backer kits. So hopefully soon they'll be sent out. But for now, we're kind of in a limbo state where we're waiting for backer kit to approve everything. But then they'll be sent out shortly afterwards. It doesn't change our timeline or deliverables. Like we'll still deliver everything around November. So you'll still get everything at the same time. The backer kit update is, the backer kit survey is just for us to like get all the information to know where to ship things to, for example. So still on time. They're just delayed by a day or two probably. It should be by the end of this week. We wanted to get them out last week, but you know, here we are. What else? You can also update your pledges and things like that then, so don't worry too much about it. What else? General updates. We are going to probably change how often we send newsletters and things like that, so expect that. But you'll hear more. Yeah, I'm going to keep using these weekly live streams to kind of talk about the guides and tutorials and answer questions and things like that. Oh, that actually reminds me, important note before I log off here in just about a minute, is there, even though I just keep saying we're having a weekly live stream, next week there's no live stream. After that, we'll have live streams every week again. It's just next week we don't have live streams, so sorry about that. After next week, we'll be back on a weekly live stream, and we should have live streams for quite some time, and hopefully we'll build up our guides pretty quickly. But yeah, next week there won't be live streams. There'll also be no fireside chats on Monday. There will be a fireside chat on Saturday. So just heads up. All right then. No questions so far. So it seems like everyone followed everything and understands everything. So maybe this was too easy. Maybe we'll make it harder, more topics, move a little faster next time. Do give me feedback. I'm always listening. So anyway, with that, thank you everyone for joining me today, and see you next week. Bye-bye.